Hello everyone, I'm Instructor Hollon, and this lecture is on evaluation and problems with natural law theory and the theory of rights ethics. Okay, so last week we looked at the theories of natural law and human rights, and we saw a common denominator between the two theories in that both ground moral truth and value in human nature or in traits, characteristics, properties of human beings, things that we all have in common in virtue of what we are. Okay, so for this lecture for this week, we look at some criticisms that philosophers have raised with these theories over the years. The first problem is that traditionally the theory was combined with theism, a belief in God. Okay, so this think of Aquinas's version of the theory, for example. Um, his theory presupposes the existence of God to ground the eternal law. Remember, we saw that Aquinas had different distinctions for law and orders, so to speak, and the highest was the eternal law. Since if there is no, so if there is no ground of the eternal law, say someone doesn't believe in God, or if there is no God, then there is no guide for the natural law that follows, so to speak. This criticism is discussed by Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, page 73. Now, in response, you might think that we have good reason to believe that God exists or something, and so that this objection wouldn't be theoretically as problematic as made out. Okay, that's one response. Another response here, though, is to consider that secular or non-theistic versions of natural law have indeed been developed over the years. For example, evolutionary ethics. Okay, so for more information on non-theistic versions of natural law that can potentially then address this problem, see Klenk, Evolutionary Ethics in the Matthews book, 2020, pages 75 to 88. Okay, so the second problem then, at which we'll look with natural law theory, recalls Hume's famous argument, or is ought problem, the problem we had considered earlier in the course. This problem says, as a reminder, this problem says we cannot say things should or ought to be based on descriptions of how things are alone. Remember the distinction between a prescription, a value claim, and a description, factual claims about just how things are, in fact. So we need to bridge this gap between values, between facts and values, between the is and the ought. So Hume gave examples again from nature, such as that, say, animals eat their young, or practice incest in the wild, yet we don't want to say these things are okay for us, right? So these examples show we can't just blindly look to nature for a guide for how things should be. And so this is his charge against natural law theory, right? Also, some things seem unnatural, but do not always matter or seem morally irrelevant or amoral. For example, wearing clothes. It's not our natural state, but it doesn't seem to be a matter of moral rightness, depending on the kind of clothes we wear. Really doesn't seem to be a matter of morality, right? Now, of course, We don't want to say people should run around without clothes, but wearing clothes in and of itself seems to be a convention we've adopted. Okay, or taking medication. Medicine alters something with the body. You might think, therefore, all medication is unnatural and so bad. But medicine can be very good, especially with treatments, therapy, etc. So another example would be body piercings. We don't naturally have jewelry and body piercings or tattoos, so natural law would say these things are bad, but they just don't always seem to be a matter of morality. So not always, anyways, right? And etc. So we can multiply those examples. So put another way, nature just does not always matter. So for this argument, more on this argument, see Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, page 73, and see Klenk's Evolutionary Ethics in Matthews, 2020, page 80. So in response, we'll see a little more in the course when we turn to meta-ethics. But in response, I note simply here that Hume's argument is probably too strong, in fact. So to see this, consider the following scenario, right? Imagine a mischievous pantheon of Greek gods on Mount Olympus, right? And they get up to all kinds of stuff there, right? Little plots, unethical behavior at times, right? Zeus is always seducing someone somewhere, that kind of thing. So as we describe the scenarios here, we could ask the questions, are their actions good or bad? Right or wrong, right? Now, naturally, it seems we can say yes, but we couldn't ground those moral judgments in anything supernatural or unnatural with their powers or commands. Remember the divine command theory at which we looked as well in the course. So Hume's problem says not only can there not be natural properties to ground morality, it actually shows that there cannot be unnatural or non-natural properties either. So because we could always ask if the gods are behaving as they should, or behaving rightly or wrongly, right? So the unnatural state of affairs is not enough to tell us. So we get the same kind of problem. What this shows is then that on Hume's argument, he's really saying there cannot be natural or non-natural properties of to ground moral truth. And that's a rather big pill to swallow, because those are the only kinds of properties that could do the job. So Hume's theory is that that moral judgments are not judgments of truth. They do not have truth values. They are merely expressions of emotion. And this is called emotivism. Okay. Now, most ethicists today do not agree with emotivism. There are long-standing problems with the theory. And we'll look more at those problems in detail in the course when we turn to meta-ethics. For now, I just want to note that his argument seems too strong. It has too much reach and would show that there couldn't be any moral properties to ground truth if it were a good argument. And that's a big pill to swallow because we think that things like murder and child molestation and rape are wrong and not really just not liked by people. Okay, so we'll look again more at emotivism and Hume's theory when we look at meta-ethics next week. So we can note this, though, as a response to this is-ought problem, Hume's objection against the natural law theory, that, well, this argument seems maybe too strong, so it's not a reliable guide here. That's all I wanted to note. Let's look at the third problem for natural law briefly. This problem is that it has actually two versions. We'll look at it. The problem is that the theory assumes everything has a goal. Remember last week we saw that moral, say, directives were grounded in what Aristotle called a telos, or a nature. And this is something internal uh, to the entity or to the thing, and it gives a kind of guide, okay, a formula or a blueprint, okay. Um, and so, according to this objection, then we'll look at two versions. There's a questionable assumption about whether everything does in fact have a telos, and in our case, whether human beings have a nature. That's the objection, okay? So the first version of this objection is that some doubt whether a human nature even exists, okay? According to this argument, natural law theory assumes that everything has a telos or purpose. Again, so it presupposes that there is a thing called a human nature. And the problem is that this is not obvious to people. Okay, if there is such a thing as a human nature, what is it? What is it made of? What is it made? What does it mean to say that something has a nature? So now we enter into metaphysics. The traditional answers to these questions have sounded antiquated to moderns. Okay, and so they should be taken into. So the objections should be taken into serious consideration before assuming something like a theory of natural law or rights ethics. Okay, so this problem is related to the realist versus nominalist argument debate in the history of philosophy, and this is a criticism about the existence of uh, um, regard over the existence of essences or natures. Right now, what happened theoretically? Remember, Plato thought that the world was in flux, an eternal state of change, right? And so we thought there were these unchanging forms, and they kind of exist in a higher reality, and they give kind of existence to our reality as shadows, reflections of this unchanging eternal realm. Which knowledge really reflects how things are on that eternal realm, so to say, because it's unchanging, and so that's how things can change down in our realm. Well, Aristotle, Plato's greatest student, thought that was too far fetched, and so what Aristotle did was he said, well, these forms could be real. They're thinking about a way to counter skepticism that anything goes, and they're thinking, well, if there's something unchanging, then you can have knowledge. It's not anything goes then, right? But Aristotle thought, well, why have these in some Platonic realm apart from the physical world? Maybe they're just in everything that we experience in the material universe, right? So Aristotle took these forms and put them into reality. Now, it's these eternal, unchanging forms that become our natures, or the natures of things, okay? Think of the form of human being then. That's what is common to human beings, and that's the nature of the human being then. That's what informs the matter of our body. Aristotle rejected the atomic theory of matter. So what clumps the matter together or gives it its properties and such? Well, that's dependent on the natures or the forms that happen to inform the particular things in the world. In our case, we're talking about human beings. So people turned to this view for hundreds and hundreds of years and developed it in different ways, and eventually people came to question it really, that, well, how do we know such things like that exist even, right? And so some people arguing against metaphysics thought we just didn't need them after a while. They sounded too occult, unknown, or mysterious. Now, what happened now, historically, people like John Locke and others had argued against Aristotle's theory of real essences or natural kinds. So if you think what grounds the human nature is something like the Aristotelian natural kind or nature, then you could see how this objection makes sense. People wonder, well, does such a thing really exist, and how do we know that? We have to do more metaphysics. Is it that involved? Uh, well, what happened now historically is that philosophers came to recognize, following the lead of scientists and then working in tandem, that things can have empirical natures, so we don't need abstract Aristotelian natures, but rather we can have mutable or perishable or changing natures. And those natures are then dependent on the particular molecular and atomic properties of the matter of the particular thing. Okay. Now, in the case of human beings, more than just physical matter matters. And in evolutionary theory, we'll look at things like group membership or a history of evolution in primatology, right? What we've come to recognize then is that different criteria can be used to judge whether something is a certain kind of thing or not. We know human beings aren't alligators. We know we're not talking about ants. So there is something that is a human being, and we just think it's less abstract as Aristotle thought. It has more to do with matter, chemicals, and our evolutionary history, our shared history on this planet Earth, right? So if you think that way about natures, you can try to answer this objection against natural law and say, well, it's not so mysterious. It doesn't have to be as mysterious after all if we follow the modern scientific realist. Think about the periodic table, right? There are apparently real properties for specific molecular compounds. And they have properties that we've classified, and we think that's real. Okay, so that's one objection. That's one way to respond to this objection that human natures seem mysterious and so therefore might not exist. Now, the idea is that they're so mysterious that any ethical theory grounded on that theory is bound to be just as problematic or suspicious, right? So you kind of answer or calm the worry so that you don't generate this problem for natural law theory. Okay, I've included a reader from Ayers on the Locke versus Aristotle on natural kinds issue for those that are interested in following up more on this sequence of arguments, ideas on this argument. Okay, so let's look at the second version of this argument regarding a concern with human natures. So according to the second version of this argument, we'll call it 3b, you can grant that, well, maybe there are natures. Okay, whether Aristotelian or like the natural or like the scientific realist today, natural empirical natures or something. But even if there were, theoretically, there seems to be a problem with how we read these natures, how we interpret these natures and their relevance to us in moral behavior then. So this is another strategy, another strategic way to argue and criticize natural law theory. Okay, some theorists, so for example, some theorists focus on positive traits for human nature, and however, people have disagreed historically regarding what follows from their reading of nature. So you might question that initial kind of optimistic attitude about human nature, and what if you actually have a pessimistic view, right? But for some examples of these disagreements and their relevance, some people have justified slavery as a natural state for some. And for example, Aristotle himself thought that there were some people whose natural state was to be enslaved. Okay, so the charge is also raised against evolutionary ethics too then. So whether it's theistic or secular, right, this argument is meant to target both versions of natural law theory, because natural law has been used. So with regard to evolutionary ethics, natural law has been used to justify, say, social Darwinism, the idea of survival of the fittest, and that's too brutal, we think, to be a reliable guide for morality. So for that argument against, say, secular versions of natural law, see Clenk Evolutionary Ethics in Matthews 2020, pages 78 to 79. Now, so notice how this argument is really the same as the general argument from disagreement against ethical realism discussed earlier in our course, right? The realist about natures then could respond in the same way theoretically. Okay, and the idea there is that, well, yes, there is disagreement when we turn to read human nature. That's a fact. But there is also areas of agreement. So why just arbitrarily focus on the disagreements? If we want to properly assess things, we should include both sets of data. And once we do that, we see, well then, hey, look, we do agree about some things. As I mentioned earlier, we can agree that we are not alligators or fish, and that we do share some evolutionary history with other primates, so long as we can find some agreements here about human existence, human origins, and so human nature, then maybe that's all we need for natural law, right? We don't need to master the concept of human nature and exhaust the factual data to understand that we are talking about human beings and not books and shelves and computers, right? So maybe that's an objection, a response to this objection you can give. Okay, so let's look then at the fourth argument against natural law. And this one is that natural law is an unhelpful guide. Okay, so for Aquinas and other natural law theorists assume that people will come to agree on practical application and normative judgments using reason. However, in many cases, equally rational people still disagree about a great many things. So the appeal to reason and nature alone does not answer many normative questions regarding how to behave. Okay, so it's not always helpful, even if we do understand nature. Okay, so for this argument, even if we do understand our natures, that's the idea, right? So for this argument, see Demock and Fisher, 2017, page 74. So the problem is very general, though. So here's a response. This problem is very general and probably applies to every theory. So in this case, however, the idea may be that natural law theory is even more uninformative than typically expected of other theories. So it's an acute problem for natural law theory. So I gave a response and a counter response there. Okay, so there are things that natural law theorists can say about all those four of those problems. Okay, and some responses have been mentioned previously in passing, but collectively these arguments are sufficient to give any researcher, and us then, pause for reflection about natural law theory. Uh, the theory cannot be taken for granted, whatever we decide. Even if we end up concluding it's a good theory, we should respond to these objections intelligently. Okay, so let's turn now to the discussion of let's turn now in lecture 2 discussion of natural rights theory. Okay, natural rights, the problems with natural rights theory. The same objections at which we just looked arise for ethics of for rights ethics, and that is because rights ethics presupposes human natures as well. Okay, so people disagree about what is a natural right and what is not. For example, some countries have identified different rights. Okay, if there are such things as natural rights, why is there so much disagreement regarding what they are or their classification, identification? Okay, second, there are people who may not pass the criteria for natural rights due to illness or malformities, right? But we do not want to exclude them from the moral community. Related to this problem is the place of non-human animals in the picture. Where do animals such as dogs, cats, horses, etc. stand in relation to the moral community if they do not have the proper nature for moral consideration for rights? To the extent that the theory of natural human rights presupposes natural laws then, or human natures, then making the necessary changes, the previous arguments apply to the theory of rights ethics as well. Okay, so that's so to summarize then, the problems at which we looked really can apply to both natural law theory and rights ethics. You might have to reword some things though in the discussion to apply the arguments from against natural law to rights ethics, but the ideas will be the same. Okay, so in addition to the readings from the textbooks, I've included some supplemental material that should help to explain some of the concepts at which we look today. I've also linked 2 PDFs in the module for this week, and the first one presents source material by Aquinas from his Summa Theologica on natural law theory, and the second is the Locke versus Aristotle on natural kinds article by M.R. Ayers that I had mentioned previously. Okay, that article is relevant to the question of human natures because it shows that there are accounts of human natures or essences that do not presuppose outdated theories or worldviews, for example, are compatible with evolutionary theory. Okay, now if you're an Aristotelian, I don't want to bias the discussion against your conception of essences or natures either, but you'll have to just find some other way to deal with the objections. And in fact, you could look at work by Fesser, who's tried to do that. And if you want to send me an email or ask me for some suggestions on sources by scholars that have defended Aristotle against these kinds of objections, the Aristotelian idea of human natures anyways, let me know and I can make some recommendations for follow-up work. Okay. Okay, and I close with the thought that these issues are important when considering the claims of Stamos and others who argue against the fundamental coherence of human rights on the basis of evolutionary theory. Okay, I include a Stamos lecture in video in the module for this week, and so I'm specifically speaking to his concern, his argument there. Okay, so there's a number of multimedia and videos linked in the module, and I recommend in this week's module for engaging the material, I recommend viewing the sources to help learn the material. And if you have any other questions about the arguments, responses, objections, responses, counter responses, just feel free to send me an email, stop by office hours on Zoom, or drop a question in discussion forum. I'm happy to provide any information for the guidance where possible. Okay, so thanks for joining me today, and I will see you guys soon. Bye-bye.